adaptation is managing the unavoidable, and mitigation is avoiding the unmanageable, and you have to put those two things together. And of course, we do this in pursuit of development itself and the Sustainable Development Goals. The art of all this is to blend all those three, and that will be the main point of what I have to say. It's clearly insane to go on without recognizing climate change, to think you can act as if it's not there. That is just madness. And what we're seeing from this report is much, much more than that, that actually these are very strong, very productive investments that we make when we deal with adaptation. I thought the triple win language was very helpful. And obviously, you reduce the losses directly. If you have less risk because you reduce the losses, you lower the cost of capital, and you have also new opportunities through the innovation associated with adaptation. That's the second win. And the third win is all the other benefits that come with it. And I think the mangrove is a very telling example here. It's been mentioned by the speakers on the platform, by Anand in his presentation. But there's a very important idea in this. We know that the mangroves help against storm surges. We know that they help with the fisheries. But they also are an enormous asset for people enjoying the natural capital. Now, I happen to be on the board of Sanctuary, an important Indian charity around conservation, and there is often a focus on tigers, not because they're the one thing that matters, but they're the top predator. If they're there, if they're doing well, because they're the top predator, the rest of it is doing well, and people come to see them. There's enormous tourism, for example, potential in the mangroves and what they offer. We have to think of those things like the mangroves. We have to think of them as natural capital, natural infrastructure. It's not that we are worrying about something that's going to delay development in some sense, that will divert. It's exactly the opposite. This is very powerful investment in infrastructure, natural infrastructure. And that idea, I think, is crucial here. You will see that of the 7 trillion that the report describes convincingly, in my view, in terms of the benefits, 4 of those 7 were in resilient infrastructure. 4 of the 7. 1.4 was in water management. That is really also managing your natural infrastructure. So what we've got here is a story of strong new infrastructure. And that's why India's call for a coalition for disaster resilient infrastructure is so important, and it's why the UK will be supporting that call for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure at the UN Summit in a couple of weeks or so time. And of course, we trust that India and other countries will support the UK's call for action on adaptation and resilience. The one thing I would add to the report is a bit of a stronger emphasis on the way in which mitigation, adaptation, and development come together. Because restoring degraded soil is a very, very big example of exactly that. What we do essentially when we restore degraded soil is we create new development, we create agricultural productivity, we create resilience because there's much more productive land. But we also capture carbon, and we put all those 3 together. Systems for root intensification of rice. One of the recommendations was to put more money in the CGIAR. I endorse that very strongly. But if you think of the system for root intensification for rice, Nalanda, just in Bihar in India, has been a pioneer here. What you see is you transplant in slightly different ways. You do not flood the paddy fields. If you don't flood the paddy fields, you don't release the methane. You save water. That's good for development. You save the energy associated with lifting the water, and you produce in a way that is more resilient to difficult weather climate conditions. So agriculture, a very powerful example of development, adaptation, mitigation coming together. Public transport is crucial for the lives and livelihoods of particularly poor people. Resilient public transport is strong adaptation, and it's good development, and of course it's mitigation because it saves the emissions from private cars. In buildings, in decentralized solar, everywhere you look, adaptation, mitigation, development come together. So that's the one thing that I would have emphasized, underlined just a bit more strongly, and I know that you know, but I think that's something that we could build in still more strongly. Now, India itself, of course, is enormously vulnerable to climate change. If you look at the glaciers, the big rivers of India in the north depend on the snows and glaciers on the Himalayas that catch the water, give you more even flows. Without those, you get terrible floods at some times of the year and no water at other times of the year. North India is particularly dependent on the monsoon. Climate change could derail, if you excuse the metaphor, climate change could derail the monsoon. We don't yet know exactly how, but we do know it's vulnerable. Cyclones batter both sides of the Indian continent, and we know desertification is important. So the Himalayas, the monsoons, the cyclones, the desertification, India is enormously vulnerable to climate change, and of course we know that before long India is likely to be the biggest emitter. India is absolutely at the core of this whole story, and it's why it's so important to be here, and it's why we welcome the leadership on India, both on mitigation and adaptation, and expect that leadership of India on the mitigation adaptation to become still stronger. Sheila, I've lived and worked in one village in Moradabad district of UP now for 45 years. Most of the growth in that economy in the last 30 years has been through involvement in the informal sector. When I first went to Palanpur, all the buildings, but nearly all the buildings were kacha. Now they're nearly all pakka. Who did that? They did it themselves, right? They built it themselves. So what we've seen is that the informal economy has driven the growth in outside agriculture, has driven the growth in that village, and informal investment has been at the core. So it's absolutely fundamental that we do not think, when we think of climate resilient infrastructure, that we do not think only of the big things. We have to think. NREGA, the Employment Guarantee Scheme in India, has been very important in local infrastructure. So when we build resilient infrastructure, that's the kind of thing we have to think of, not on the margin, but at the center. So I completely agree with you, Sheila, on that. Informal is normal. That's the way people live, right? And that's what we have to recognize, and what, unfortunately, some people doing development don't necessarily recognize. So let me conclude then by reiterating my admiration and welcome for this report, emphasizing that we must bring mitigation and adaptation and development together all the time because they are everywhere, to support India's idea, which it will take to the summit on the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, and call on all those here, as I'm sure they will, to support the UK when it acts for the Secretary-General of the UN in its call for action on adaptation and resilience. And we all will welcome you to COP26 in the UK at the end of next year, after, of course, it's been confirmed of COP25 that it actually will be in the UK in COP26. But let me remind you that you may have noticed that the UK politics is somewhat chaotic at the moment. What is absolutely remarkable through all that is the shared conviction that we have to be strong and we have to lead on climate. The UK has declared for zero emissions by 2050. So for all the chaos of UK politics, which I think is an objective description of where we are, that constancy is absolutely remarkable, and it does cheer me up just a bit. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lord Stern. Always a delight to hear you.
I agree. My experience is rural.
Well, we have some time left for questions. Any comments? If you can address it to particular speakers that you would like to. Anyone? I know Dr. J.R. Bhatt is here from the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change in India. Any comments you would like to have? Anyone else?
Oh, thank you. So, thank you, sir, for this opportunity. And I'll quickly make best use of time, and maybe if you allot me 2 or 3 minutes, I'll say something in terms of some views on adaptation, as that is the landscape. First of all, welcome to each and every participant once again to India and to this magnificent city. Mitigation and adaptation are often equated, but one addresses the root cause, the latter adjusts the system up to a point. We need to think of limits of adaptation. Some provide long-term resilience, some only temporary relief. Adaptation, let me remind each and every participant, does not revert system to all original benefits. Loss and damage start creeping in. Also, I would say that adaptation is now a universal requirement. It has started knocking at our doors, as has been said by the speakers, distinguished speakers on the dais. It is a parcel sent to the developing world, knocking at our doors by developed countries, and the parcel has been sent by them to themselves also. So nobody is isolated, all are vulnerable. I am glad that the speakers also touched about mangroves and their role, the natural assets. You know, at a time when the world mangroves are on decline, on India, I am very happy to convey and share. These mangroves are on ascendance, and areas behind mangroves during the 2004 December tsunami and the 1999 super cyclone in Orissa have taught us that areas behind mangroves are safer. They suffered less damage from the cyclone and the other natural calamities. I would also say that to the extent that adaptation guides us to more sustainable practices than before, it is a welcome step. However, even so, it cannot be expected to be safe from climate change. And I was very happy when the vulnerability of India was being discussed in terms of 1.3 billion people that are there in the country, nearly 18% of cattle population, 47,000 plant species, 1 lakh plus animal species already identified. And we are also hosting 70% of world's tiger population in wild in our part of the world, in our country, and also more than 30,000 Asian elephants. So one would wonder that we are making good use of every inch of the space. that we have, because we have only 2.4% of land area in the world, and yes, we are vulnerable. But the speaker also said that, India is a large emitter, and that is something which I should go on record, that it is not only just the current emissions, but the cumulatives which cause the trouble. And if you see the cumulative and per capita emissions, both are dismally low as far as India is concerned. It is like this, that for a second, if we imagine, the future is in a realm of conjecture. Past is an act, collective act by our brothers and sisters from the developed world, which has put the whole world in jeopardy. And now when it comes to things like adaptation, there is a imminent need which the speakers have already flagged. I am very glad about new and additional resources, technology transfer, capacity building, so on and so forth. We look forward to the report, and we are very happy that this kind of a discussion has taken place today. And grateful thanks to you in particular for giving this opportunity to intervene. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatt. That was Dr. Bhatt from the Ministry of Environment and Forests in India. Any others? You want someone there? The mic, if it can. Can one of my colleagues please help with the mic also?
Thank you. Tony Shantanis from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We're making an announcement later on today about the importance of business being part of this work, and business recognises the importance of committing and working with others to the importance not only around the UNCCD priorities, but of course around adaptation. I had a couple of questions. One was to Nauka and the other one was to Nick, if you'll indulge me. So around the work that Jeff is doing, of course you have your adaptation fund. I'd just be interested to hear from you, Nauka, around what you see the priorities of the private sector being in helping to both support the fund's implementation, but what you would expect to see from business to make sure it's up to scratch. And to Nick, of course, I know that you're also closely involved in the work of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We've been working with a number of our member companies on the preparer forums for this, because our companies know the importance of adapting to climate change in terms of reducing the cost of capital and making a more resilient business, but it's fantastically hard to measure and understand that risk from the farm right up to the chief financial officer level. I was just wondering what your work in this space is doing to help on the adaptation side for businesses to really understand that in the context of agriculture and land degradation and the sorts of issues that we're talking about here today. Thank you.
Would anyone on the panel want to respond to that? Anand?
Should I?
Oh, yeah, please.
Because first, both of them.
Is this mic working?
I think it's Mark one.
Yeah, so this, you go ahead now.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question for the Jeff. In terms of the priority, and you actually acknowledge and is aware that we have two funds. It's the Jeff Main Trust Fund and also the funds for adaptation. But this dichotomy, the side of the one fund for mitigation, one fund for adaptation, was completely outdated in my view. So that what we really want to do is to, as actually Nick also mentioned, there is no point of thinking about one strategy for adaptation, one strategy for mitigation. It all has to come together under the consistent, coherent development strategy. So from that point of view, what I committed to my team and to the globe is to how to mainstream this adaptation through the entire JEF portfolio. And as I mentioned in my opening very briefly, there are 3 areas I think that we want to prioritize. One is a food and land use system. It's not just a food security. Food security is important, but we would like to address the food and land use as a system to actually do mainstream adaptation. And if I were the farmer, I really can't have 2 plans, 1 plan for mitigation, 1 plan for adaptation. I should decide what would be my plan for next year or 5 years from now. So from that point of view, I think that we want to take it as a more like a coherent strategy. And here, the role of the private sector is extremely important because these are the ones who are on the ground and to make a decision that what's going to be the planning for next few years. And I had a privilege of actually having a conversation here in India with very prominent private sector from farmers and big business, and they all make the same kind of point that the importance of coherent planning and strategy, and also the value chain and to how to capture that to enhance that the resilience of smallholder farmers. Without them, there is no point of talking about that a resilient food system or that land use system. So, and then they are also the ones who are so excited to bring technologies and innovation on the ground. I'm quite impressed at what's going on there. And I think that we have to really actually capture those new innovation, new opportunities coming from the private sector, how to actually to make sure that we have an opportunity that a conducive environment for them to really flourish. The second area was cities, and here we also have a sustainable city plan, or actually the impact program. And here I see that again, that from mayor point of view, you can't have 2 plans, 1 plan for adaptation, 1 plan for mitigation. These really have to come together. And there, the role of the private sector in terms of innovation, technology, what they can do, and in terms of resilient infrastructure, planning and resilient infrastructure is extremely important. And we have already done a few good examples. Nick also mentioned the building, the transport, and so these are the areas where we have been working together, and we want to continue to do more going forward. So thank you so much for the very, very important question.
Thank you, and thank you, and thank you for the work of the World Business Council on sustainable development. It really is first class. Now, before I answer the question around the task force on climate-related financial disclosure, how many people in the room have ever heard of the task force on climate-related financial disclosure? You can see the first problem. Yeah? The task force on climate-related financial disclosure arose when Mark Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, in his role as head of the Financial Stability Board, which is a product of the central banker's central bank or central agency, he said, Carney, in a very clear and important lecture about 5 years ago now, that climate risk was a risk to the stability of the world economic system. Now that was very important because it meant then that ministers of finance, the IMF, the World Bank, indeed the Financial Stability Bureau, would have to take account of climate change, not only of course through the terrible cost it can bear on in terms of lives and livelihoods, but of course within that, the stability of the whole economic system. So in other words, it is an economic stability macro issue, which those in finance ministries and those in the running economies making policy around the world have to make central. And it is not central enough in the public discussion of macroeconomics, including, by the way, here in India. It is a cause of instability, it damaging the environment, constrains growth. It has to move to the center of the story. So how do you move it there? Well, the first message of this report is understanding. And we don't yet understand. We know enough to know that the risks are immense. We know enough that we have to act, and we know enough that we know how to begin to act. But we have to deepen that understanding. And we have the IPCC and the science that comes through strongly, but it is not closely linked enough to lives and livelihoods of people and businesses and so on. So this report makes it very clear that it's a fundamental understanding issue. In the UK, we have the Environment Agency, which does work very hard, but it's only beginning, but it does work very hard to try to translate the climate change effects into the kind of physical effects that you're talking about. That seems to me to be important in every country of the world. There ought to be very close systematic study of the link between the risks that the science is identifying and lives and